These are works I've done over the last 3 years, starting with Greater Los Angeles and taking a look around the Los Angeles Basin, out to Orange County, the Inland Empire, up into the desert that we see across the top. This is a new piece based on global warming and the ocean flooding San Diego County below Mount Palomar. I've done the same thing here in Laguna Beach. This is actually built on an older painting where the original coastline was out along this edge. And what I've realized is I can flood my oceans with too much paint, and what do you know, they flood inland and work against the edges of impasto that I built up, and I'm able to get these fractal edges in my morphology. This is 2 or 3 years worth of painting, and interestingly enough, as the pour dries up against impasto, you get to see a wrinkling, and it reminds me so much of the tectonic hills, and it's what happens if you put too much liquid paint. And of course I'm doing it on purpose for expressive purposes. I've also gone back to doing some Northern California pieces. This is my alma mater area, Stanford, and the southern San Francisco Bay. When I was a student there, it was almost too complicated for me to paint the bay flats and the evaporation pools. But recently I found it to be an ideal subject in that I can make drawings with impasto paint that define pour areas. And as I pour, I let the paint work and find the boundaries, and then I flood the land and I flood the ocean. This is a close-up. One of the things I've noticed about the book is if you make a large painting, it gets correspondingly smaller as it hits a given size piece of paper. So my idea here is to include detail. This is what I'm saying about the bigger paintings. This is the biggest painting of all, but you don't see much detail. But I'm going to give you one, and keep your eye on this spot up here. It's the Coyote Hills. And what I'm doing is I'm cycling as much personal information as I can. So this is a close-up of the Coyote Hills. It's one of the few hill structures right on the edge of the bay. Let's take a look at Florida. One of the perfect places if you're going to look at global warming. 2 cities are on the hot seat for global warming: Palm Beach, Florida, and Miami Beach, Florida. This is Palm Beach with Mar-a-Lago right over here. Water is basically eating away the coastal waterway and flooding the inland, very flat Florida terrain. Same thing is happening here. I expect this would be not too far what may happen over the next 100 years or so in Florida. This is my Miami Beach, which I've done repeatedly. I'm not projecting them. My earlier work was photorealist, and here I'm doing a very loose outline of the coast, all in wet paint. I often squeeze the paint to create the initial gestures, and then I flood it as I see the global warming starting to increase. This is Miami as well, and I'm trying to get a little bit more bathymetry going to be able to show underwater what's happening. I've included 2 recent pieces of New York. Now, for 10 years, all I did was paint New York City. I've probably painted that city more than any other place on the planet, dozens and dozens of times, but I had not painted it for 17 years. It's all going to get flooded too. And this is the Brooklyn shipyard, and that'll be one of the first places to go underwater. This is stepping out a little bit, and we have Coney Island and parts of Brooklyn looking more like the Pleistocene beaches that actually formed them, and the glaciation that came down and deposited a lot of the sand that's in this part of the world. I also have returned to painting Washington, D.C. I'm going to just show you one example of my D.C. Diamond series. The initial design of the District of Columbia was a diamond shape. Of course, this is the global warming version. I have a nice little detail here of what's happening along Georgetown and the flooding. This is Georgetown, and this is Rock Creek, and the Potomac's coming down, and I'm harnessing these currents of liquid paint. I'm going to conclude with what I've been doing here in Alaska. Now, I've been going to Alaska for 35 years, and I've gotten to know the areas in between. And as I've studied geology and geography and geomorphology, I recently came across a show called Unsettled, and the thesis of this show that there's a greater West, and it includes Western North America, Western South America, the Hawaiian Islands, which if you look right here and look closely, you can see these little protrusions, which are the Hawaiian Islands coming out of the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and of all places, Australia. So I took a real shine to this concept of the Greater West. This is from 2017. Spending a lot of time on water in Alaska, so I love to paint the landscape with lots of rivers and lakes that sit in permafrost, a lot of navigable rivers that I spend my summers trying to float down and go on fishing safaris. So these are all kind of in the back of my mind, back to my theme of showing some details. Recently, I had shot this shortly after I made it, and then I realized it's been on the wall for now about a year. And I said, I really should reshoot that, because now I see all these wonderful little lumps and sutures forming along the various formations that have happened over the last year as the paint dries. This, too, is the north coast and the terrains, the way the land accumulates. It's rafted onto the continents. It's accredited to North America. We see lots of blooms and algae and plankton and sea life that attract whales and all the northern sea populations of fish and other animals. A detail. So I think it's a pretty good example of this morphology. What I got onto was letting the nature of the materials allow me to come up with some ways to invent how to paint in a new way, and to let the materials morph as I see the geology itself morphing. Another one of the Great North Coast. And if you look closely, I'm sculpting the mountains. That's another thing I'm trying to do, is making the relief more like small sculptures, not necessarily mountains, which is what I've often done in the past. I'm now thinking, well, I can just make whatever shapes I want, because I'm kind of sculpting the paint. So I see these paintings as half sculpting, half pouring. This is a nice detail of the pouring. These last three big paintings I'm going to end with. This is, again, the whole coast going up, terrains coming in, giant rivers cutting down through all the layers of rock. A nice detail of what that looks like up close. You can see the extreme expressionism that I've harnessed my whole life. Lots of rhythm, lots of texture, lots of activity. This is probably the best painting I've done probably in my whole life. Spent about 6 months working on an artist statement. When I was finally done, I got home. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and this one line jumped into my memory, and I had said, boldly proclaiming, I had invented a new painting language, because I had spent years and years painting from satellite images. Most people paint from something they see in front of them, from the figure, a still life, a landscape that you see across the way. I spent decades painting from satellite images. And somehow that ended up giving me a new language, is what I'm claiming. So I got home and I said, what new language? And so I basically started in and said, okay, here's the new language. It took about 3 days. I didn't stop till I was finished. It's a really strong piece in that it's a synthesis of so many different processes that I've developed for decades. Last painting. There's a big debate on what happened to the land between Vancouver Island and Alaska, and most of this is British Columbia. Some people said the land had just literally moved all the way up, and that was the explanation. There's a missing gap in here where the rock is not the same. Other geologists said it didn't move 1,000 miles north, it moved east underneath the plate, melted, and became in the volcanic flows that you see in intermontane Canada. And this is my attempt to reconcile what happened to 1,000 miles of coastline. Did it move north, or did it go underneath the continent? Just thinking about it makes me want to make these paintings.